Right. Welcome. I'm Sharon Constançon. I am Chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce, and I welcome you to where I am today in South Africa with everybody else, except I'm hiding in the bush. I'm not actually in an office at the moment, so apologies for my environment and my background. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be running today our Global Citizen Series. We've been running this for a few years now, and we do 4 interviews a year generally, where we pick on, and Clem a second time around, key individuals who can give insights into issues that are prominent at this current time, that quarter that we are dealing with in South Africa. All of us know Clem. We've known him since the 1990s. He was the one who steered South Africa to a civil change of government, and we have definitely got him to thank for that. And when we look forward at what is coming ahead of us, we hopefully are going to thank him again for his contribution to solving our world. But that is for Prof Francis Petersen to discuss with Clem, not for me. And now it's my honor to introduce Prof Francis Petersen. He's Prof because he's Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Free State. He is equally a board member of the South African Chamber of Commerce, and he's the chair of the Universities of South Africa and a board member of the, I need to read this one, National Transmission Company of South Africa. So many of us, including the Chamber, are honored with his input, his logic, his thought processes, and it's very different from an academic to an entrepreneur. I know that because the two of us are different, but a very wonderful insights that he has into the world and a wonderful chairing style, particularly when he's talking one-to-one with somebody he knows well and respects extremely well. Both having been and spent a lot of time at Anglo, these two gentlemen know each other extremely well. And I am now going to hand over to Francis. Thank you very much, Francis, for running these series with your team. We really are honored. And I wish you a wonderful 3/4 of an hour and pick up with you for the last 15 minutes.
We'll do so. Thank you very much, Sharon. And it's great to have the chair of the board of the South African Chamber of Commerce being here and present this afternoon as well. You were struggling about the last entity, the National Transmission Company of South Africa. All the South Africans on this call and on this platform will understand it immediately, so you don't have to worry about that. But my conversation this afternoon is with Clem Sunter. Now, as you said, everybody should know Clem. Clem is an international best-selling author. He's a futurologist. He's an excellent scenario planner. And the time that I spent at Anglo, I always said that I did interact with Clem. I was responsible, amongst others, for strategy at Anglo American Platinum, and he was looking at strategy and other businesses at Anglo American. But where we ran into one another was in the basement, because we parked next to one another. So that's always we would touch in the mornings when we go to the office. But Clem, it's fantastic, and Clem is gonna talk, as we have advertised the Global Citizen webinar on scenarios post our elections. And we all know that the elections is happening next week already, 29th of May. And it's going to be our 7th general election, and we're all looking forward to be part of that. But before we get to the scenarios, I thought that I want to very briefly, first of all, Clem, once again, welcome. And it's great to see you. But I want to start off the conversation, because that's actually what we're going to have. We've got 30 years of democracy. And perhaps you can maybe give your impressions or your views on how South Africa actually has performed and have done over the last 30 years. Failures, successes, anything else that you would like to mention. And I think that's probably a good segue into our exploring of the scenarios a little bit later. Your views, Clem?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. What a privilege to be on this webinar. I'd like to go back to our high road, low road scenarios of the mid-1980s. They were written by Michael O'Dowd and Bobby Godsall, and they were really brilliant in capturing two things. Firstly, the idea that the National Party could negotiate a settlement with the ANC, which was our political crossroads, and a lot of people thought was unthinkable in the mid-80s, but of course it happened in the 1990s under the leadership of F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. They were brilliant to come together, and we avoided the kind of civil war that you've seen in other countries by doing this. And you could only capture that in a scenario at the time. You couldn't have forecast that it was going to happen. But the second thing they did was to say that it's not just about politics, it's about economics as well. And there is an economic crossroads further down the line, 20 years down the line, maybe, where if you haven't actually got a fairly high rate of economic growth and low unemployment and the economy is blossoming, you can undo all the success that you had politically and still take the country down to the low road. So there was always those two crossroads in the future. And since we negotiated the political crossroads successfully, I would say that the 5 years under Mandela, we actually did grow the economy fairly successfully. And we built houses and we did all kinds of things. And it extended into Mbeki's period as our president. And so we've had a successful period in the last 30 years. But unfortunately, under Zuma's leadership, the economy flattened out. And then our infrastructure started needing repair, like Eskom. And so I have to say the last 10 years have been not as good as the first 20. And we're now at that economic crossroads. We just have to get it right after this election. And one of the real points about this election being watershed is that it is 30 years since we became a democracy. So it's not all about liberation and the past. It's about the future and trying to create a successful, inclusive economy.
So, Clem, and I don't want to dwell too much on the 30 years, but you correctly sort of described the 30 years. And when I talked about the 30 years, I said it's not about a linear path, and one should actually break it down in periods of decades. First 10 years, the second 10 years, and the third 10 years. And in fact, I think it was from when Mbeki took over during that time period that economically the company generated a surplus. I think around about 2008. But since then, it actually went downwards. Was the Zuma period really the period where you think we went backwards on that trajectory? That 10-year period.
Yeah, look, I look at the flags before you get to the scenarios, and one of the most important flags to see whether a country is on a winning path or a losing path is the crime and corruption flag. And unfortunately, we haven't yet managed to bring down violent crime enough in this country. People are still very fearful in the streets, and we've got to do more about that. And our police are unfortunately under-resourced at the moment. And corruption, as we all knew, reached a kind of maximum during that period, and then, thank heavens, has started falling, but it certainly hasn't fallen enough. So the crime and corruption flag is still pink to red. The second flag is the quality of infrastructure, which we all know has not been good. And, I remember Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese president, saying before he started the revolution in 1978, which led to China becoming the second largest economy, there are two things which you need. One is a quality infrastructure, and the second is people creating wealth for themselves. And unfortunately, we haven't got a quality infrastructure at the moment. It's water, it's electricity. We've got to do things about our health system. I know we've got NHI now, but we've got to do stuff to improve our hospitals and our schools. There's lots of stuff that we've got to do to get our infrastructure good. And secondly, the other flag, which we haven't yet got, is an entrepreneurial culture which is supported by government, where township economies are being, freed up to integrate into the mainstream economy, where people can start businesses anywhere and become national champions and maybe international champions. Those flags have to turn green for us to have a positive future.
Yeah. So Clem, I just want to move on, and I've got another question just before we get to the scenarios. So next week, hopefully everybody is gonna go to the elections and make their cross. But I want to, and there's a lot of polls that's been running, in the different parties, talking about the ANC, talking about the DA, the upcoming support for the MK party, and so on. What is your views? How do you see that? What do you read in the polls on our way to the elections?
Well, there are essentially three scenarios playing out. One is that the ANC do get over 50%, maybe just over 50, but they do manage to just get over 50%. And of course, that scenario has been severely tested in many recent polls, that they won't actually get over 50, but there's still a feeling that they could rebound on election day and get that kind of percentage. The second scenario is that they end up in the upper 40s, in which case they can do a deal with the IFP or another small party to get the majority. And of course, the third scenario has been played a lot by the pollsters, which is they fall into the low 40s, and then they have to do a deal with either the DA or the EFF. And depending on which side you're on in terms of capitalism versus socialism, there's a lot of uncertainty and dread around that third scenario. And I would say recent polls have suggested that the ANC are going to do better than people anticipated about a month ago. So it's everything to play for.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we will watch those polls, obviously closer to the time, to the 29th, and it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out. But Clem, let's move into the scenarios. We've now, if we reach the 29th, the voters have voted, and from your perceptions, the work that you're doing and have done. And talking about briefly what you just said in terms of the polls and how things have changed, what are the sort of likely scenarios that can play out post the elections?
Well, I would like to quote from a presentation I was given at a meeting I attended about 2 weeks ago. Absolutely brilliant scenarios, three of them, written by a trust called the Inlulamiti Trust. Inlulamiti in Nguni means giraffe, and that means that you're looking over the trees at the horizon to see what the long-term futures might be. And they are a brilliant bunch of people. And they came up with three new scenarios. They started in 2017 and wrote scenarios to 2030. They've now just come up with three scenarios to 2035 based on birds. And often it's the name of a scenario that gets into people's minds. And it was like high road, low road just got into people's minds. It's important you choose memorable names. And I do believe these are, because they're based on birds. And the first scenario is around Hardidars. And I like to call it the Hardidar blah blah scenario. It's because we all know the bird has this raucous call when it's flapping its wings and flying along. But nothing really happens. And this would be a situation where, we still have broken promises by politicians. Things just don't get done. We gradually drift down. There's a lot of, voices and rhetoric and everything else, but it's just the cawing of the hardy-dars. And we all know about that scenario because we've had plenty of it in terms of, a better life for all, but we certainly haven't achieved it yet. The second scenario is actually worse. It's the vulture culture scenario. It's where, we do have a sort of increase again in the kind of corruption that we've seen. And as you know, vultures silently move in and take their food and then fly away. And we would see that kind of activity, unfortunately, increasing again, which could lead South Africa to a kind of gangster state that you have in South America. And obviously that can lead to a wasteland and the end of sort of foreign investment and stuff like that. But it's the positive scenario that they offered, which it goes to the center of the challenge that faces us. And I like to call it weaver's nest, because weavers are small birds, they're very sociable, but they build these gigantic nests. And it's by working together that they do it. And for me, that is the positive scenario for South Africa, because we have lots of little weavers' nests all over South Africa where people work together very effectively. I mean, in my own case, I live in Somerset West, and go to the shopping mall, go to a restaurant, go to a wine estate, whatever it is, it's brilliantly run by a diverse group of people of all colors, and they operate it. And that's why tourism is so good in this country, that they produce the product together. I mean, Siya Kolisi was another example, in leading us to become the world rugby champions again. I mean, I know it was 1-1-1 in the last 3 games, but nevertheless, he did it.
It's a win.
the diversity of those players, and he brought them together as a team. So we have lots of little weavers' nests around South Africa that we can grow, but we need a government to realize that if you really want a successful economy, you've got to grow it from the bottom up. It's not about top-down socialist directions and things like that. It's about allowing entrepreneurs to really flourish. I did a debate in 2016 with Julius Malema at the Cape Sun, and it was for a dinner there. And I said, I'm just as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. I don't want to nationalize the mines, the banks, the land. What I want to do is to create real freedom for ordinary South Africans to get together and build businesses all over the country, get rid of all the red tape, introduce local stock exchanges for crowdfunding, get big companies to designate a percentage of their supply chain to growing small businesses, all these kind of things. That's what will create economic freedom. And I'm just so pleased that the weaver's nest scenario is just a lovely and elegant way of describing this particular model.
Yeah. So Clem, I want to connect the second part of our discussion with this one. So the second part, you were sort of giving indication what could potentially play out before the elections, on the way to the elections. And the second, what we were talking about now was more exploring the scenarios. I don't know whether you got a sense of the 3 scenarios, the Hadida scenario, the vulture culture one, and the weaver's nest. What configuration of political alliances will take us to the weaver's nest? Because there is now also the possibility of coalitions that could come in, which also complicate the things a little bit more.
Well, I have to say that, the ANC, during the COVID-19 pandemic that we had, they operated very well with the medical community. I mean, Cyril had his panel of doctors. made decisions which, were in concert with what people were doing elsewhere. But essentially, we managed to get through that pandemic, I think, extremely well. And, the vaccines were available. It for me, was just such a magnificent kind of example of the kind of leadership you require to grow the economy, because it wasn't sort of laying down every single law. He got a whole bunch of energy going amongst people to try and stop getting COVID themselves, and it spread. What I want now is Cyril to surround himself with some real entrepreneurs so that they can give him real advice on how to help all the small businesses in this country. Because work has changed. In the last century, hundreds of thousands of jobs were being created by big business and big projects around the world. But automation and robots have actually transformed the nature of work. And the latest statistic in America is that two-thirds of the jobs are being created now. The new jobs are being created in small business and micro business sector in America. And that's why the unemployment rate is below 4%. And that's the only way we're going to drive it down to that level. So what are the parties, the coalitions that might achieve that? Obviously, I do believe that quite a few of the very small parties are absolutely behind this model. I think the DA is, but as I've said to them all along, you've got to actually come up with some real positive stuff of what you're going to do for these young Black entrepreneurs in the township if you want to get additional votes in this election. So, obviously what I would like to see maybe is if there is a coalition, it would be between the ANC and some of these minority parties who could then, drive this whole new agenda on creating an inclusive economy.
Yeah. So just spending some time on the weaver's nest. I want to come back to some of the other two scenarios as well a little bit later, but just on the weaver's nest, entrepreneurship and driving the entrepreneurial spirit is what you have emphasized, and I totally agree with you. I think the small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurship is going to be playing a much more important role going forward. But South Africa still have got big business as well, and there need to be a message that has to go out to investors that should come and invest in South Africa. Now, obviously, we know that electricity is one part that we need to get right, and you're talking about infrastructure and transport and logistics is the other one. But politically, Clem, keeping in mind what potential coalitions could play out, what do you think the message of that, either the ANC, if they are at say above 50, or the ANC was a smaller party, if they are just below 50, in the high 40s, or the ANC with a substantial larger party, when they are quite below 40. What is the message that needs to go out? I'm not talking more about the investors that come and help us to build a much more stronger economy.
Yeah, look, investors usually go on, the results. And, we've got to have a 3%, 5% growth in our GDP. We've got to obviously have a stock exchange that gives people equity gains. Investors go where the figures are good. I mean, let me give you one example. I've said over the last, since 2000, so we're talking 24 years, that if you want to invest overseas, it's probably best to put your money in America and not the UK or Europe, for one particular reason, which is the aging of population. And unfortunately, the UK and the European population is now aging almost to the extent of what's happened in Japan. And I'm afraid to say the grey flag of an aging demography really reduces your interest rates. And the UK stock exchange has gone up maybe 20 or 30% since 2000, whereas the American stock market has tripled. And that's where investors go because, that's where they can get the returns on their money. So for me, it's not so much the rhetoric of politicians that count in terms of getting investors here. It's about creating a kind of weaver's nest mentality amongst all the communities, which then gives you the kind of economic growth that people say, ho hum, I'm going to invest in that company in South Africa because, they're doing much better than others. And, there are so many areas where we have centers of excellence where we are technically in advance of other countries. And, it's never reported in the press. I mean, I've often referred to a guy called Siobelele Zuza, who has a minor asteroid named after him by NASA for the advances he made to rocket fuel. And this was quite some time ago. But, for me, he would have been a beautiful example of saying to others, this is what you can do. And so, it's not so much I want the politicians to change their rhetoric and be a different type of hardy-dar. I want to get down, roll up the sleeves, and get going on the nest. And it's made up of twigs, grass, leaves, all the different components that make it up. And if there's one good example recently of it, it's what's happened with electricity, because it's only now, because of this incredible partnership between the private sector and Eskom, that we've got back to a state where we don't have daily load shedding. It's great. So how can we take that example, apply it to transport, apply it to the hospitals? I'm not against NHI, but I want to see a proper partnership between the private sector and the public sector in order to achieve it. And it's those achievements that will bring investors here rather than just the talk.
Yeah. Clem, I thought you're going to say now that I'm on the National Transmission Company of South Africa's board, the load shedding has suddenly stopped. But you didn't want to say that. But I thought I just wanted to mention that. So coming back to the weaver's nest, if I understand you correctly, that scenario talk about working together. Is there changes or thinking or things that we can do as ordinary citizens to ingrain that culture? Or is it government, whoever is the government of the day, that have to create an enabling environment for that to happen? We should both.
Both. And I mean, Francis, you're a good example. I mean, the University of the Free State has done incredibly well under your leadership. Leadership really counts. It's one of my separate flags, that I have now in terms of the global economy. And unfortunately, we don't have that kind of positive leadership to unify the world. And that's why we're becoming more polarized. And it's a tough world out there because we haven't got the kind of leadership like we had in the late 80s with Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, which got rid of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. It all comes down to leadership. And there you are, you're a leader of a university and you've done incredibly well with it. I remember when I was chairman of the Anglo-American Chairman's Fund, within 30 seconds of interviewing a principal, you could tell whether you wanted to give money to that school. Was he a passionate leader, good leader, whatever it is? So for me, one of the keys to creating a weaver's nest is to create this whole matrix of leaders around the country of their own communities, and all the institutions that go with that local community, and of course the mayor and the politicians as well, which will lead to that transformation of the economy. And leadership plays an incredibly important role.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. One of the first people that I have had in conversation under the Global Citizen webinar was Jeffrey Sachs from University of Columbia. And we were talking about reforms on the one hand in global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank and others, but we also talked about the concept of leadership. And we can clearly see now the absence of that if you specifically talk about the West. But Clem, there's only two other questions that I want to ask you before I'm going to give back to Sharon, because I know that there's obviously quite a lot of questions from those that are attending this seminar and looking for it or listening to it. The Adidas scenario, nothing really happens. And I'm gonna try to push you a bit here, Clem. In the move towards the upcoming elections, and we know the parties that participate, and we know their track records. Are there warning signs that we as voters should be looking out for of most possible outcomes from the political parties that could take us to the Adidas scenario, and that we should just be worried if we look at the manifestos of different parties and so on? Is that something that you also built into the scenario? I know that is a little bit outside, but I'm going to push you just a little bit to help us through our thinking as we move towards next week. And obviously, everyone needs and can make their own decision and should make their own decision.
Well, France, my kind of view is that this election shows that we've moved on. I've kind of watched it every day over the last month or two, and there's nobody saying, oh my gosh, if the ANC falls into the 40s, they're going to try and, reshape the votes and stay on in government and do all the things that other dictators around the world have done. There's no talk of that at all. And it's because we have a very good electoral commission. I think our election is going to be up to the highest standards of the West. I think that is a huge thing for South Africa, because there's nothing about marshalling the army or the police or anything. So those highly negative scenarios that you can write for many countries in the world that hold elections have been utterly absent in South Africa at the moment. Mm-hmm. And so in a funny way, I think that all the kind of argy-bargy that we've had between the small parties and the big parties, and even a lot of people are saying that Julius and the EFF have sort of toned down their rhetoric a lot in advance of this election. I think that this has reduced to a very, very low probability, a kind of negative outcome, and the kind of stuff we had in KwaZulu-Natal during the COVID pandemic, when suddenly there was all this looting of malls and stuff like that. I personally, I think that's not the kind of thing that we should fear, and that's why I quite like these three scenarios produced by Inula Miti, because it's that we just end up in the empty rhetoric scenario after the election, and we don't do the things which will reduce our unemployment rate from the hideous level it is down to the 4% in America. That to me is the crunch. I think that we've got an incredibly sound democracy politically, but we have still got to create a sound economy.
Yeah. Clem, my final question, we probably got about 3 or 4 minutes before I hand over, 3 minutes to hand over to Sharon. The Global Citizen webinar series is also directed to the future generation. And the future generation are those that currently studying at universities, amongst others. If there's a message that you would like to give to the university sector against the backdrop of your three scenarios, and particularly probably the working together scenario, what will that message be for our young future generation of leaders that we currently are training?
Well, obviously, one of the things I've already talked about, which is a lot of you are going to have to become entrepreneurs, and you've got to be part of small teams that create businesses. You've got to be like the Steve Jobs of this world at Apple. You've got to get together with friends and you've got to start businesses, because it's not like the last century when you could just get a good matric, a good degree, wave your CV around and get a job in one of the big businesses. Those days have changed forever. Not just here, but around the world. And as I said, America has shown with its brand of entrepreneurship that it can still keep its unemployment rate very low by encouraging people to create wealth for themselves. And up till recently, the Chinese did the same. So that's one thing I would be saying to young people is prepare yourself for the future of work, not the past. The second thing I'd be saying to them is that one of the reasons why the Weaver's Nest scenario of working in a cooperative way is so important is because there's an existential flag out there, which is the green flag of climate change, where, you know, the one thing environmentalists are saying right now is that what surprises them is that all the kind of nasty weather and nasty kind of trends, which they thought would only happen in the second half of this century, are happening now. There's a phenomenon called atmospheric rivers, where water is being channeled into abnormal rainfall zones in places like California, in Afghanistan, in Doha. You know, it's changing the world. And of course, we with 8 billion people, we're displacing a lot of the natural species. So I would be saying to young people, you know, we all have to get involved in trying to preserve our planet, because we have never, ever before put the planet under such risk as we are now. And, you know, we're paying for it. We're already paying for it. And that's the kind of words that I would be giving to young people.
Yeah. Clem, before I hand over to Sharon, just it was fantastic just to catch up again and to have this brilliant conversation. You're always so passionate about what you do, and it was just fantastic to be able to talk to you, conversation style. Sharon, at that note, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francis. We've had some really good comments in the chat about your the conversation you two gentlemen have had. So thank you very much, Francis, for your massive effort and contribution towards this. There was one comment that did make me laugh, Clem. Why aren't you standing in these elections? Why isn't it you who's up there? Why is it politicians who are up there? And isn't it a difficult one that we have? Is those that are in business, those that are in the world of creating our economies, are not the kind of people who are typically likely to stand as a politician even later in their careers. Quite interesting.
Yeah, but it's true around the world. It's not just true here. It's true in America. It's true in Europe. You seem to now have professional politicians who kind of never have had other careers, and that's why there's this kind of lack of relationship between the private sector and politicians. And yes, America's doing well, but you just look at the UK at the moment. It's in a big mess. And one of the reasons is that you just don't have that kind of interaction, which there used to be.
I think business and government working together is absolutely critical for economic stability, for us to get to the 10% growth we're quite capable of. I remember when I was at school decades ago, we used to talk about the fact that South Africa can do a lot more than the 4% it was doing then. And we always seem to be talking about we should be doing a lot more than whatever we're doing, but now is the worst it's probably ever been. But the question I want to ask is the ideology within the ANC, where does that provide a natural desire or engagement with the private sector? From what I'm understanding, it isn't in their ideology. And how would we change that in the next 5 years?
Well, all I can say is, I mean, Cyril is still leader. He was in the private sector. He knows how the private sector works. He did that incredible job, as I said, in the during the pandemic. We've got to repeat that with something which is now much more important, which is the economy, where, you know, we assemble not just another advisory body, but a serious team which leads to serious decisions being made to open up the economy. And yes, there is a bit of socialist ideology in what I've said in terms of creating the weaver's nest. They're sociable workers. And in that sense, there are a lot of things in capitalism which I don't like, such as the hideous inequality of income and wealth that you see around the world. That since the financial crisis of 2008, the super rich have gone back to being super rich and even richer, and the middle class and the working class haven't done that well, particularly after you take off the effects of inflation. So, yes, I want to try and create that kind of mixture of a formula, which leads to the kind of happiness spreading amongst members of community, because they've got jobs, they've got a meaning in life, and they're earning money. And I therefore am one of those believers in a kind of mixed model, rather than saying it's all about capitalism or it's all about socialism. We've got to find something that works. And it's why I've always talked about foxes and hedgehogs. Foxes look around for things that are practical and work, whereas hedgehogs tend to stick to one idea, one ideology. We've got to try and blend it into a formula that creates really successful weaver's nests.
Just picking up on one of the comments you made a little earlier, because you gave me insight into some research I did last week for a customer of mine, and they were wanting to have a look at the return on investment, in other words, the indices prices of various stock exchanges around the world. And they were all pretty low. Japan, extremely low. UK, very low. And yet the US and the JSE, looking at a couple of the JSE indexes, were absolutely showing well over the 25% mark. You have just given me the reason why, because I got asked that by the customer. I said, I've no idea. But I'm now going to go back and say it's because we've got a young population, and therefore we have that opportunity. One of the things yes, carry on.
I was just going to say that grey flag of the aging of the world's population is probably one of the biggest flags of the second half of the century, because it's not just Europe and the UK. China right now is feeling the effects of that flag. That's why the Chinese economy is not going to grow at 7 to 8% per annum anymore. They're middle-aged because of the one-child policy they had. The population is actually decreasing at the moment by 1 million or 2 a year. And so China is now being hit by this grey flag. And in the second half of the century, America will also be hit, because they're not actually having children or women are not having children at the replacement rate. So it's a kind of feature around the world. And of course, there will be people who argue that will be one of the reasons we'll have a sustainable planet, is the fact that in the second half of the century, our population might naturally decline.
Talking about green flags and age being potentially a green flag opportunity for South Africa, we talked about creating jobs 30 years ago. We employ far more people today than we did 30 years ago, but our population has grown much faster than the rate that we've been able to employ them. And obviously, therefore, we come up with these statistics of such high unemployment for the youngest age group. And you then, if you look at all the various conversations on the chats and things that you've brought through very, very clearly, is we need to educate ourselves to be entrepreneurial, to get on and solve the issues ourselves, because there's no big corporates with handout jobs anymore. Talking practically within the weavers environment, if you were talking to a 10-year-old who hasn't yet got to high school. You're talking to somebody who's 18, leaving high school. Let's assume they've made a matric. And you're talking to somebody who's leaving university at early 20s and has passed their degree of choice. What would be the advice you'd give these three youngsters?
Well, one of the things I did, when I was, talking about the high road, low road, is I emphasized the small business development. And I talked at many schools, and I said you should start an entrepreneurial program at your school where, on one day at the end of term, people can actually, sell at a market day whatever they produced or whatever their services. And it's the old story. There were teachers who passionately followed this, and actually it did lead to quite a few of the people who left the school forming their own businesses afterwards. So I would challenge the people who create the model of our education system that they've got to have that kind of entrepreneurial element in the curriculum, which allows kids to consider it as a pursuit after leaving school. And, I have to say that life is all about taking the right road at unexpected crossroads that you come to during your life. It's not predictable. And so one of the points is keeping your mind open to all the opportunities that can exist. And yes, there are people who do technical degrees to become engineers or medical degrees to become doctors. And I'm not in any way saying that shouldn't happen. But I do feel strongly that we've got to add this extra element so that kids are prepared for the markets of the future. Because, work has changed.
Work has changed. And there are quite a few questions around education. And one of the points was around creating your own small community that can cross-educate themselves without necessarily being able to be in the formal sector of education.
Yeah.
So you could actually end up with 5 youngsters together who are all interested in building a business. So how do they go and self-educate themselves, which I thought was quite an interesting philosophy to put forward, that we don't have to rely on the education system and the government. We don't have to rely on charities. We actually should also be relying upon ourselves. But how do we remove the government red tape to allow these youngsters to actually take their innovative ideas and be able to create something that can become part of the formal sector?
Well, Sharon, I have to say that, one of the points I make about people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all their names are mentioned as if they did it by themselves. They didn't. They had a group of friends who made up for their weaknesses in other areas where they had strengths. And that team created Apple. That team created Microsoft. If Wozniak hadn't been Jobs' friend, they wouldn't have had the incredible, remarkable internal workings of the iPhone, iPad, and all these kind of things, because but Jobs was into beauty. He was into calligraphy and beauty of the exterior of an object. So you need these crucial kind of teams which are good at one thing or another. And they've got to get together spontaneously in a community and do it. But then the mayor of that particular city, or the governor of the province, and then obviously the government of the country have got to, really think of all the things they can do to cut the red tape and actually support these people getting together. And that's why I would like to see a small circle round the president, just as we had during the COVID, advising on what the real things that you have to do to get this kind of thinking for yourself. And as I said, weavers' nests are not built by some one bird sitting on top saying this twig should go there and that twig should go there. It's because there's a kind of internal energy that's created from the kind of freedom that you have. And that's why the phrase economic freedom is such an important phrase.
Yes, very much so. So what can business do, to pick up on your very specific point of Cyril has proved that he is capable. Let's use that word. He has done it in the private sector, and he's done it when there was a crisis. How can we get him to recognize this crisis and actually get that team of people around him, do something to step out of the framework of the ANC structure that we sense is holding him back, and you acting as an anchor for him to be what he could be?
Yeah, no, but you're quite right. This has got to, and it comes back to Francis's point about which coalition would you prefer to achieve the weaver's nest, and or be negative and say we're going to just have more of the hardy-da blah blah. The answer is I would like to see Cyril actually having maybe a coalition where these ideas are explored, not, as I said, by having another advisory body, but in a real way where, decisions are taken within 3 months of the election to start freeing up the economy, maybe even sooner than that, to show that we're now in the action-oriented phase of working together, rather than just it being the blah blah of hardy-das continuing. And I just want, because we have such talent in this country, and in the townships too, and the township economies are actually incredibly sophisticated, and it's just that we haven't learnt enough about them to say, gosh, if we can add this finance or this system of getting into other markets by having internet websites which you can advertise your products and business on, we would create a new revolution, and it would be a bottom-up one rather than a top-down one, which is sort of classic socialism. And we've just got to, explore this, because we are at that economic crossroads I talked about. And what we don't want is that to turn then into sort of conflict and then worse still, become a failed state. This is the moment when we've got to construct the economic model that goes with the incredible political model that we put together against all odds in the early 90s. We showed the world that we could create a political miracle. Now we need that economic miracle.
We do, and we need every single South African in their passion for the country to do all of those things to we can do it. And what I appreciate out of this interview that you've made so clear is there is a road through the minefields that we can become weavers. We can work together in a community environment and uplift our community from the bottom up. And it's really enlightening, because we're always talking about such a negative things. Oh, the elections, oh, the negative, oh, the ANC, oh, this, oh, that. So I really appreciate the fact that you've given us such a strong, positive message. It can be done, and you've proven it and delivered it for us once before. So we look forward to seeing all of us making that delivery possible. But a couple of questions that have come from the floor, which are sort of little cheeky one-liners, so I'm going to share some of them with you. One of them was, what about Minister Naledi Pandor as president?
Yeah, that is a possibility. I would want Naledi then to sort of get the message that the kind of president that you would make you really successful is one where you immediately establish this Council of Entrepreneurs to help you build up that kind of inclusive model that I'm talking about. So yes.
And another question is, are you able to give us your personal view? And we know we've still got 10 days out to go to the election. Is it just over 50? Is it reasonably close to 50 but under, or is it closer to 40? Where would you put your expectations on what the voting public are going to do?
Yeah, technically, what I can say is, what is my most favored scenario? I think my most favored scenario is upper 40s, early 50s for the ANC. and but they may have to do the coalition. I'm not sure that on the day that you're going to see a scenario of the 41%, which was explored, a few months ago. It could do that, but that's why you're a scenario planner, because you've got to capture the unthinkable. But am I giving it high odds at the moment? The answer is no, because over the recent kind of last week, it's become apparent that there is a surge in kind of support in various provinces for the ruling party. So yeah, and that's my best shot. Is it's either over or
brave
just
one. There was a news broadcast that came out this morning saying that the MK party cannot stand in the elections. There was, and it's also come up as a question. I also saw it on the news. What is that going to do for the ANC?
Look,
and will it hold until the 29th?
Well, to be quite honest, I'd like it to hold because, let Jacob Zuma get whatever percentage of the vote that he can get and stuff like this. What I've loved about the lead up, as I said earlier on, is that, there just hasn't been any kind of intrusion on people standing to vote and all the stuff, as I said, that can take place in other autocracies that pose as democracies. We've had a, surprising freedom of speech, freedom of creating political parties, lots of posters on the streets and everything else. And I think, gosh, that's a real sign that we have become a truly democratic, demos kratos society, people power society. And so no, I don't want suddenly the lists to be lessened. I mean, one of the nice things about the 94 election was that the IFP got added at the end and got stuck on the bottom, to make sure that it was an all-inclusive election. And so I prefer to have that than to have a party being eliminated before it happens.
And one last question, because we are on time now. And this plays partly to what we were saying a moment ago. We are aware of the multi-party charter, which is a number of the smaller parties, I believe, seeing how they could potentially work together. What is the role they could play in being the solution in a, what's the word I'm using it? A coalition, that's the word I wanted.
Yeah.
How could they?
Well, that would, for me, I've been thinking about this when I talk about, the ANC possibly doing a coalition with the smaller parties. It could essentially be with the NPC, which includes the DA. And in fact, it would give the DA a lot of extra strength if the smaller parties were thrown in and it was a genuine coalition to get on with the job of creating this new economy. So I've got no problem with that. The only thing one has to say is you've always got to have an opposition. I mean, one of the points of democracy is that you've got to have a party checking up on another party. So I don't want it to get to the extent that it's, so big that it turns into sort of one party government, but in the form of a huge coalition. But I certainly think that there's a possibility that if the ANC falls into the low 50s or into the 40s, a deal could be done with the NPC as opposed to a specific party.
Mm-hmm. And Ikebelo has just corrected one of the potentially misunderstood statements in connection with Zuma, that the party can stand, but the person doesn't want to go to Parliament. So anybody just want to read that to make sure that it is understood and we didn't, between any of us, cause any misunderstanding.
As I said, I want his party and him to stand, because I do feel that, you know, it's been one of the wonderful things about, you know, the lead up to this election, that we haven't had this sort of dreadful thing of excluding people. I know that people have been excluded for corruption, which is correct, but on the whole, it's been a real open game as far as the lead up is concerned.
Well, let's hope everyone goes to the polls, does their bit, make sure that they stand for what they believe in. And just on my side, I just call on everyone, please do your best to be present and to vote for your country and to vote for your province, your city, your community. And let's pull together, as Clem has suggested, the weaver's nest syndrome of actually growing our economy from where it is at a crossroads at the moment. So thank you very much, Clem. And to you, Francis, appreciate it. You're absolutely wonderful. And to your team for pulling this all together, and for the team at the Chamber. We had some excellent numbers present today and some excellent registrations. Well done on both of you. Thank you. And Clem,
thank you.
Thanks once again. You're an honor to speak to.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.